Welcome to the Analytic Christian. I'm Jordan, and this is the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. I'm very excited because we're going to be talking again with Dan Speak. Hey there, Dan.
Good to see you again.
In the previous two interviews, we talked about the logical problem of evil and the evidential problem of evil. Now we're going to focus on the problem of divine hiddenness. And the connection, just to remind the viewer, is when we talked about the evidential problem of evil, we focused in on gratuitous evils. And at the end of the interview, we said it seems like there's this particularly troubling gratuitous evil, and that is this evil of the hiddenness of God. People really want to know him and really want to be in relationship with him, and yet they find themselves unable to believe in his that he exists, and so they can't have a relationship. That's the idea. That seems like a very challenging type of gratuitous evil, because what purpose could there possibly be in God permitting something like that? It seems like the greatest good for this person is to come to know him. So why would he permit them not knowing him? That's what we're going to be focusing on in this interview, and I'm really excited to jump in. So, hey again, Dan, and thanks for coming back on.
Absolutely great to see you. Good to be talking about these difficult issues with you.
Once again, everything we say in this interview and the previous two interviews are expanded on at much greater length, even though it's a little book. It's so awesome. I'm so glad you wrote this because it's super concise. You write very clearly, and it still gets a lot of depth in there. One of the chapters in this book, I think it's chapter 4.
That sounds right.
Yeah, is on divine hiddenness. So that's what we're going to be summarizing tonight. Okay, let's jump in here. So you begin that chapter by talking about John Schellenberg's argument from divine hiddenness. So what is this argument?
Yeah, good. I think of it as a very powerful problem. It's not merely intellectual, like the evidential problem of evil. It's not merely intellectual. It lands for almost everyone, whether you're a theist or not, a certain kind of concern for. I mean, sometimes the literature has taken to calling this the problem of divine hiddenness. Maybe that's not exactly the right way to put it. Maybe it's more like the problem of divine silence, or the problem of divine, or the problem of non-belief, as you nicely put it earlier, Jordan. So what I'm basically leaning on here is a fairly influential argument that John Schellenberg formulated. This first formulation of it that I have here on the board was in his 1993 book, and he's updated the argument at various points since then. I don't think any of the updates are going to be really important for the points that we want to think through tonight together, but it's worth knowing that that's there and that there's new work to be thinking about with his. But the basic structure of the argument has stayed pretty much the same, and it turns on just the points you were making before, Jordan. So if you think about this first premise, it's that there's a deep linkage between whatever the notion of God is and the beings being perfectly loving. Now, maybe that would have been obvious independently, but nicely, Schellenberg makes it perfectly explicit, right? So that if there is a God, then this God is perfectly loving. You know, a being that's like just awesome, but doesn't love. Maybe we'd have to bow down to it, but we wouldn't worship it qua God the way Schellenberg is thinking of it here. And that has seemed to many plausible. Okay. Second premise is this, but look, think about this. If a perfectly loving God exists, this is where a lot of the excitement in the argument is. If a perfectly loving God exists, then reasonable non-belief won't occur. We'll think a little bit about what reasonable non-belief is, but the idea is supposed to be that if God is perfectly loving, God's not going to let people be non-believers, at least if they're being, in some respects, reasonable. Sometimes he calls this inculpable non-belief. So he's taken now to calling it a non-resistant non-belief, right? And we can think more about that. But then just to get the premises out, then the third premise is this reasonable non-belief, or this non-resistant non-belief, or this inculpable non-belief, it exists. There are people like this, right? That are out, that we encounter them. And then that just from those three, then four follows there's no perfectly loving God. And then given that God, given the first premise, has to be perfectly loving, that must mean that there is no God at all. So that's the basic structure of the argument, and it's powerful and intuitive, and we can work it out in some detail going further.
So it really trades on this idea of reasonable non-belief. So let's summarize here. What does Schellenberg mean when he talks about reasonable non-belief?
Yeah, and that's it's moved around a little bit over the years, but we can get at the idea just by thinking about what it would mean to not willfully resist believing in God. There's nothing wrong with the person's will. They're not trying to not believe. They're not stupid in a way that they've caused by their own volitional efforts, right? So they're sufficiently open-minded, fair-minded, and intelligent and prepared to believe if given enough evidence. So the idea is they're not managing their beliefs in some bad way.
Okay. So and I'll just speak from experience. You won't know this individual, but he's a friend of mine. He has a YouTube channel, and he's kind of like, in my mind, he's better at philosophy than me. I could say that up front. He's better at philosophy than me, and he interviews top-notch atheist scholars, and he himself is an agnostic.
Yeah.
But he is just an incredibly kind, fair-minded guy that it will say like, hey, I would totally worship God, love God, if it just, if it was clear to me that he existed, but it's just, that's just not clear. So I've got somebody like that in mind. His name, he won't mind if I say this. He knows that I really appreciate his work. His name's Joe Schmidt. Joe Schmidt is such a great guy. And yeah, he just seems like he's a prime example of somebody that has reasonable non-belief.
Good. I've got a few people like that, but people who your channel will know that strike me like that. William Rowe was one of those people. Like, I never ever got the impression that William Rowe was resisting, that he certainly knew the arguments better than I did, right? As you're saying, he's a better philosopher than me, and he was not willfully resisting. Paul Draper strikes me as the same way, right? In certain moods, Paul Draper has said, I think I should be trying to pray because I'm agnostic. Maybe there's a God, and I want to be in the best position to know. That's the kind of notion of a will that's not resisting. It's if Paul Draper is not believing, the claim that he's being unreasonable seems unfounded. Although you're starting to see my dispositions already to think that something like, I myself feel some inclination to think that once we get the notion of reasonable non-belief down clearly enough and compellingly enough, 3 seems to me very plausible for just the reason you're saying, because Joe Schmidt's a case, and so are Paul Draper and William Rowe and many others.
Yeah. And Joe, he actually studies under Paul Draper, so they're right in the same boat. Okay. So we mentioned a couple of cases. It seems like 3. I don't want to deny 3 because of people like Joe.
Yeah.
But there are some strategies for resisting that premise.
Yeah.
So what are, in the book you mentioned too, what are a couple of strategies for resisting that?
Yeah, good. And I think of them as, maybe 2 versions of the same central thought, right? I mean, that one way you might try to get to doubting 3 is if you have a view about the way that human sinfulness works, right? So one version of it is some people have just claimed that just each person who's actually an unbeliever is sinfully resisting in that very moment. Like each person is sinfully resisting. And, partly our Joe Schmidt cases and our Paul Draper cases are already supposed to be putting that to its, last trumps. But the other way is to think, no, it's not that each individual person is sinning in their, profound resistance, but that fallenness, that there are noetic effects. Famously, in theological terms, we sometimes say that there are noetic effects for our knowledge, for our cognition, to being fallen people, and that somehow the fallenness of human beings in the beginning has somehow transferred, and just in the way that our wills are bent in on themselves because of sinfulness in the Christian tradition, the same thing somehow, in some respect, happens to our cognitive abilities. And so people are unreasonably resisting because they've been infected with these noetic effects of sin from the fall. Not because they're doing it right now, but because it's been given to them by this sort of transfer, something like that.
So would a worry there be that, say, the noetic effects of sin, that type of strategy for resisting premise 3, it seems like the person still wouldn't be culpable for their non-belief in that case, right? So they don't believe, but it's not really a fault of theirs that they don't.
Nice. That's a really good way of putting it. And I mean, obviously, there's a deep worry here about how to think in the Christian tradition, at least, about original sin and its relationship to culpability. But I'm with you in thinking, whatever this reasonability is, that's partly why sometimes Schellenberg puts it in terms of non-culpable non-belief, right? And in order for the reasonability to be undermined, it will have to be that there's some respects in which you're culpable for it. But to your point, this seems exactly right. If the reason the person's resisting is because of these noetic effects, then it must be that there's something culpable about the fact that they're in this state. But how could they be culpable for it if it was a consequence of, what primordial humans did, many millennia ago? So I think that is a deep worry for trying to salvage that noetic effect response. Yeah.
Yeah. One response that I haven't fully figured this out yet. I read Romans 1,
Yeah.
and
Exactly.
I want to I do affirm the
Yeah.
authority of Scripture. However, when I read Romans 1,
Yeah.
it certainly strikes me like it's saying, a Joe Schmidt out there or a Paul Draper out there, they have all the evidence that they need, and they're just suppressing the truth and unrighteousness.
Yeah.
And I just struggle to make sense of that. I know that there are alternative interpretations of that passage.
Yeah.
We don't have to get into that here, but perhaps, somebody that is just really, really ultra strongly committed to the authority of Scripture and the authority of almost their interpretation would just say, I just have to go with what Romans 1 says. And so these people are suppressing the truth and unrighteousness, so they're just culpable
Yeah.
for their non-belief.
That's right. That Romans passage recurs in almost every instantiation of this form of argument. And I think there really is a puzzle about how to understand that passage. I don't have it worked out myself, Jordan, just so you know. But if you scratched me hard on how I think of it, it would probably be that Paul is giving a kind of expression to a certain way in which unbelief can come about. I'm not inclined to deny that there are people who are willfully resistant and whose unbelief is a consequence of a certain kind of volitional incapacity or volitional misdirection on their parts. That I think is right, and it may even have to do. I mean, kind of in that Romans passage, it seems to be tied to a certain degree to a kind of desire to behave in ways that are going to go sort of unchecked by obedience to God. And I don't deny that there are going to be people whose unbelief is grounded like that. I do continue to find implausible the idea that all unbelief is grounded in that. And so it puts pressure on how to understand that passage for sure. But I think you're right. If somebody does want to just camp on the Romans 1 passage, then they would have grounds for resisting 3 that I don't myself take myself to have.
All right. Well, if it's okay, let's shift to premise 2 then.
Yeah.
So you and I seem to be in agreement. Our strategy in responding to this argument isn't going to be to reject 3, but what about 2? What are some ways for resisting premise 2?
Yeah, good. I mean, you can kind of think of 2 broad kind of categories. One is efforts to, you might put it like this. There are ways of thinking about it that involve securing goods, right? So maybe the reason that God allows reasonable unbelief is that there are goods that God wants to secure only, and he can only secure them, you might think, by by allowing non-belief, right? So things that you might have in mind there, like some people have emphasized, it's really good to seek intimacy with God, to seek out God. And you might think, if that's a good in itself, it's a genuinely good thing, then if God just provides the sufficient evidence sort of easily, right on the surface, so to speak, then that undercuts the value of this seeking. So that might be a good thing, that God's seeking to secure and allowing not reasonable unbelief. Similarly, you might think that there's a sort of similar point about, sometimes I can get in this frame of mind. There's a kind of intimacy with God, a kind of closeness to God that could, that requires, how to put it, that, I didn't have sufficient evidence to believe that. Somehow entering into the relationship without the sufficiency of the evidence would give a certain kind of verve or passion or intimacy to my. Sometimes Kierkegaard can sound like this, right? That it's partly the fact that you don't have it that imbues it with a certain kind of power or passion. Maybe maybe the one I find along these securing goods direction most plausible has to do with the value of freedom, right? So what some people have argued is that if God were to remove reasonable non-belief, provide the relevant forms of evidences so that no one reasonably disbelieved, that it would impose a kind of evidential pressure on people that would be, in some respects, tantamount to coercion. The presence of God, the knowledge of God would be sort of, so to speak, too obvious. And at least for some people, it would involve, getting in the way of the goods of freedom, of really being able to choose, say, to do something contrary to the will of God. But if the knowledge of God was sort of immediate and transparent, it would function coercively in a way that would be bad for freedom. So those are the kinds of securing goods strategies that some people have deployed to try to say why maybe two could be false.
Right. So that's one approach, securing goods. And just to make sure I'm following correctly, we're looking at premise 2, and somebody says, okay, I reject premise 2 because a loving God might have there are some plausible reasons to think that a loving God, a perfectly loving God, would allow or permit reasonable non-belief for the following reasons. And all those reasons fall into this category of securing certain goods.
Yeah, there's some goods that are worth God doing this for.
Okay. Now that's one move.
Yeah.
A different move is to say, I reject premise 2 because a perfectly loving God would allow reasonable non-belief in order to avoid certain evils. So what are some of these evils?
Well, let me just mention one that's, like, I think kind of interesting. Again, I don't know how far to take this, but I do find it interesting, right? So think about, to see this good, take notice of this first. Almost everyone concedes that while belief in God might be necessary for relationship with God, no one thinks it's sufficient, right? Everyone thinks that what you need is belief plus, obedience and responsiveness in whatever goes into relational intimacy, right? My believing that Jordan exists is a long way from us being friends, right? For us to be friends, I got to do more than that. I got to check in on you, and I got to make commitments to you, and I got to fulfill my promises, help you move, lots of other things, right, that I would have to do. And so then here's the thought. The thought is, there are people who would believe that God exists, but not go the further route of responding properly to that belief in God. They would be, let's call them poor responders. They would believe in God exists, but not engage in all the other stuff. And then the claim is this: maybe it would be very bad for people to believe that God exists, but then not respond in the relevant ways. Like, that would be a very bad thing. And so then here's the thing that God might be trying to seek to avoid: giving people enough evidence so that they believe, but knowing that they'd be bad responders, then they respond poorly. So here's the suggestion: God graciously doesn't give them the evidence that they need so that to believe, so that they don't believe, and then don't end up in that worst situation, the situation of believing but not responding well to their belief. And so maybe God is, maybe one reason why two could be false is because God allows reasonable non-belief to insulate poor responders from the sort of double badness of believing but not responding well. I think that's kind of interesting, right?
Okay, now, how do proponents of the hiddenness argument respond to something like that?
Well, I mean, I'll just speak for myself, I suppose, even as someone who ultimately thinks that the hiddenness argument can be resisted on rational grounds. But like, think about all of those securing goods notions: the seeking, the intimacy, the even the freedom, the coercive freedom. There's a big looming counterexample that's worrisome, especially for Christians. You can put it in terms of the Apostle Paul case, but you can think of other cases of your own, and that's just think about a case like the Apostle Paul's, where dude gets blinded, knocked off a horse, spoken to out of the air, presumably really powerful things happen, and then he becomes surely what we think of as a paradigm of serious religious commitment. So it's hard to say, well, but it's really important to seek. Was it important for him to seek? Right. Well, it's real. This intimacy, you couldn't have this intimacy unless you had this lack of evidence. For Paul, it doesn't look like it. His freedom would have been. Is Paul's freedom constrained by the fact that he had this happen to him? If it was, it doesn't seem to have been that important to God, right? So, and Paul's of course just one case. Just go to any people who have had profound, what they take to be profound evidential experiences that have given them a kind of deep confidence in the existence of God, and who have gone on to be very faithful people. And it looks like, well, it's hard to see how just a general deployment of the interest in securing those goods could account for the reasonableness of the non-belief, since it looks like we can think of quite deeply committed folks who got the relevant evidence even in this quite powerful way. So that's on the a sort of general reason to be suspicious of the securing goods point. I mean, of the securing goods point. But now, with respect to the avoiding evils and those poor responders I was considering, I mean, I think there might be something to this, but I mean, one thing is just, it seems prima facie implausible that every instance of reasonable non-belief that you and I think of are people who would be poor responders if they were given the evidence, right? I mean, I don't know Joe Schmidt. I don't really know Paul Draper, or I didn't know William Rowe very well, but I know other people like them that it strikes me as implausible that if they got the evidence, they'd believe, but then, not do anything else with their belief. So there's a kind of, on its face implausibility to it, on my view, to cover all the instances. And then the other thing, just as a personal point, and I don't know where you stand on this, Jordan, but I think that improper response, that sort of strategy that I've just described as the improper response strategy, it probably depends on something like Molinism or middle knowledge. Like, it depends on God being able to know what Joe Schmidt or whomever would do if they were given enough evidence, and what they would freely do. And I, for one, am not a Molinist. I, for one, am someone who is deeply suspicious of middle knowledge. I'll just note that if you're in some doubt about Molinism, you might be worried about that poor responder's reply, because it's a little hard to see how God could know that all of the people who presently are not believing would be bad respond. How could God know that they were going to respond badly if given the sufficient evidence for belief, unless God had access to all of those true counterfactuals, which, if you're a Molinist or you're a non-Molinist, you're in doubt about that.
Yeah. Okay, so let's kind of assess the situation now. So I don't want to deny one. I think, yeah, there is a God, and that God is perfectly loving. I'm good with one. I said that, three is something that I don't want to deny either.
Yeah.
So, but I believe in God, so I can't. 4 and 5 just follow from basically 1, 2, and 3. So I can't. Those aren't really things that you can reject. So I'm just stuck with, what do I do with 2?
Yeah.
And given what we just said, um, I find it difficult to think that every case
Yeah.
of such non-belief is that's a poor responder there,
Yeah.
as we're calling them. So, and given my agnosticism about Molinism, I'm not all that confident in that response. Now, let's look at then. So I'm trying to figure out what's going on in 2. So let's talk about Schellenberg's support for this premise.
Yeah.
How does he support premise 2?
Yeah.
And is there a way that one can, maybe undercut his support for that?
Yeah, good. Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of attracted to a strategy here. Maybe I should say this, Jordan. Last time, and rightly so, you took notice of the fact that we were talking about skeptical theism, and we're going to talk about skeptical theism again here. And you took notice that maybe my preferred response to these problems is the skeptical theist response. A very natural thing to take away from the book. And I kind of balked, right? And why did I balk? Well, because I do think that the broad impulses behind skeptical theism, which we'll say more about in response to this argument shortly, are probative and important. But I don't think of it as the only response. In fact, I do think, as I'll say later, I think it's a kind of concern to only deploy the skeptical theistic response, and that other things can sort of dovetail with it and make the skeptical theistic response more plausible than it would otherwise be if it's standing on its own. So there's a kind of cumulative case that I think of as the right way to think about responses to the problem of evil, to at least the evidential problem of evil, and to this argument, which is structured very much like it. But I don't develop that much in the book, right? So that's. But I want to say something about it now, because one of the things I sort of like in thinking about this argument is to think about, as you're saying, why Schellenberg thinks 2 is true, and then to raise an objection to that, right? So notice how this is essentially a defensive move, right? So Schellenberg offers us this argument, and I'm not going to try to show in what I'm about to say that 2 is false, right? In the same way that the avoiding evils and the securing goods responses were efforts to show that 2 is false. I'm not going to try to show that 2 is false. I'm going to show that I don't think Schellenberg has given us good enough reasons to accept 2. And I hope your listeners can hear that difference. I'm not claiming it's false. I don't know. All I'm going to say, I don't know that 2 is false. I'm just going to say, I think I have grounds for not accepting that Schellenberg has shown me that 2 is true. And here's why. Here's his argument. He's explicit about this. Why does he think 2 is true? Well, he does it by saying this. I mean, the first thing he notes about this is, I think, extremely plausible, right? It's that if God's loving, God exists and God's loving, then God will want every creature to be able to be in an intimate relationship with God. And that's important, and it seems to me to be right. God will want that if God is ultimately loving. And you can think about the ways that being in that kind of relationship is deeply empowering, and maybe it's the most important thing in the world if God exists, that creatures are in this kind of relationship, the relationship in which they're capable with God in these ways. So all of that's right. So think of that first premise. A loving God will, and then he claims this: a loving God will always make that kind of intimate relationship possible for creatures. Okay. Then his second claim is this one. But in order for there to be that kind of intimate relationship between 2 people, the one has to believe in the other. So Schellenberg claims that believing that God exists is a necessary condition for being in an intimate reciprocal relationship with God, right? And then from that, he can conclude, so God will always make this kind of belief possible, which is just to say that there would be no reasonable non-belief. I mean, people could resist, but if they're resisting, then they're not reasonable, right? So crucial to that, since I accept that first thing, and notice, so I'm just going to get this out so we can look at it clearly, is that Schellenberg, a crucial premise in that little argument that Schellenberg, that we just considered for 2, is the claim that belief is necessary for relationship. So I'm just gonna underline that and take notice of the fact that his claim is you absolutely, in order for someone to be in an intimate relationship with God, they must believe that God exists. And then here's all I want to do. I want to raise a doubt about that. I'm not so sure that central claim in defense of 2 is right. And now here's my case, okay? My case goes like this. So my wife's name is Lori. And here's what I want you to imagine. I want you to imagine that Lori, it's a horrible thing, okay? So I'm being a little cavalier about this, but this is we're supposed to imagine something quite bad, namely that my Lori has been kidnapped, and all of my evidence suggests that she's also been murdered, right? So and fill out the details however you need to make it so that the thing for me to believe is that she's dead. I mean, whatever the evidences are, you can your viewers are smart enough to fill in the gaps and tell the story such that my evidence is she's dead. But then now just imagine that like 3 weeks after this event or something, I get an email, right? And it's I'm still in grave mourning about the loss of my wife, and the email is from an unrecognized account, but it purports to be from her, right? And in this email, she says, "Look, I've snuck away from my captors. I'm alive, and also I'm going to be able to sneak away semi-regularly and send you little notes this way that they won't know about. I can't escape, but I can do this, right?" Now, look, think about the case this way. Look, I'm not an idiot. Let's assume. I know that I could be being, manipulated by this. I know that they could be totally using this as a strategy to get more money out of me, or just to be mean, right? Just to grind it in and give me hope when there's really no hope. I recognize all of that, right? And because I recognize all of that, and I see that the evidence that I'm being given by her emails is not sufficient to overcome all the evidence I've got that she's been murdered, right? So as a result, here's the thought. I don't believe she's alive. In fact, I'm rational in not believing she's alive. But am I also rational in engaging in this email correspondence with her over, say, the next 6 months? I think, yeah, it's rational for me to do that. And suppose that over the course of that 6 months, I engage in that email exchange. We talk about our son and our grandkids and what have you. Again, all the things she's saying, I recognize. This could be just those a-holes looking on the internet and knowing a bunch of stuff and toying with me. None of that goes away. Doesn't increase my evidence in any significant way. And so I never do believe that she's alive. Now we find out, thank God, it was her all along. She was alive and it was her. And then ask yourself, was Dan in an intimate relationship, an intimate reciprocal relationship with his wife during that period of time? I'm powerfully inclined to say yes. Is it ideal? No, it's not. Of course, it's not ideal. It's not ideal. But is it an intimate reciprocal relationship? I say yes. And now note, the point here is just this. If you agree with that judgment of the case, then you agree that a person can be in an intimate reciprocal relationship with another, even though the first does not believe that the other exists. That is, I've just given you a case for you to doubt this central premise in Schellenberg's argument for 2. I think that case has got a decent amount going for it, and that we should be suspicious then of Schellenberg's argument for 2.
Okay. Yeah, so you stated that really well. So it's not the case that you have to say a certain premise of the argument is false. That's something you could do.
You could.
But
right.
Another way to approach or develop a response to this argument is to try and show that we can withhold judgment about a certain premise.
That's right.
It's not clear that it is true, and it doesn't have to be clear that it's false.
Yeah.
And so this is very much in the spirit of a defense. We're just trying to say, hey, you haven't demonstrated
That's right.
that premise 2 in this case is true, or likely to be true, or whatever. You can say, what show me your support for premise 2, and when Schellenberg says, well, here's why I think premise 2 is true, one of the crucial reasons for that is to say belief in a person is a necessary condition for relationship with that person. And what you provided with the kidnapping case and email correspondence case is that a counterexample to that support for premise 2. And as long as you have that counterexample, and it seems like, hey, tell me if I'm right or wrong about this. If somebody's like, I see the counterexample, and I'm not even sure what to make of the counterexample. I could see it being rational, or I could see it being a case that you still had an intimate relationship, even though you didn't believe in the person. But I could also see that, it's not the case that you had an intimate relationship. If they're just kind of like 50-50, that's still enough to say, well, then you're kind of left in a kind of agnostic position about premise 2 then. So then maybe you should just withhold judgment about premise 2, and then the conclusion doesn't really follow for you.
That's right. I think that is true. And that is the way I'm thinking of it. I will just note, not to take us too far afield here, Jordan, that in some moods, I'd like to get more out of this case than I've just given you here. You're right. The way I've used it in this case and the way I use it in the book is just to cast doubt on this premise, and therefore to cast doubt on 2, which is just to say, look, I don't think, Schellenberg, you've shown me that I'm rationally required to accept 2. I'm within my epistemic rights to be in doubt about 2, and so I'm within my epistemic rights to not draw the conclusion that he urges me to draw. But in some stronger moods, like there's something in the spirit almost of a theodicy, not quite, but that that I'm tempted to offer here, which is in response to this, which is a more positive claim that all I've said here is I don't think belief is necessary for the intimacy. But in some moods, I think what the case shows is that hope might be sufficient, right? So why is it that Lori and I count as being an intimate reciprocal relationship, even though I don't believe she exists? And I say maybe the relevant cognitive commitment is my hoping that it's her, right? Where hoping has this distinctive structure, right? For a person to hope that something's the case, it means at least minimally that, you want it. And
you cut out. So
sorry.
Yeah. So you said for someone to hope is at least minimally what?
At least minimally this, you want the thing to be true. You think it's possible that it's true. And you're willing to act in the light of its being true. You still losing me?
Yeah, I'm with you.
Okay. And so when I think about the Lori case, I'm tempted by the view that hope can play the role that Schellenberg thinks only belief can play. Right?
That's really interesting. Yeah.
And it goes beyond what I've said in the book, but nevertheless.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting suggestion. It's been a while, but so my friend, I don't know if you are familiar with her, Liz Jackson. She does a lot of work on Pascal's wager, and she talks about hope as well. And I did an interview with her where she offers, I think, something like what you're saying in response to the argument from divine hiddenness. But I did that so long ago. It's been at least like almost 2 years, I'd say. And I need to go back and refresh my memory. I can't quite remember what exactly she argued there. But yeah, I need to go back and see if it was what you're saying. That's a really interesting response.
I want to check it out too. If Liz has been thinking about some of that, that would be great. Yeah.
Okay, so now that's one way of casting doubt on two, which is all you have to do in a defense. You just have to cast doubt on that, and if somebody then you seem like you're within your epistemic rights to say, okay, so the rest of it doesn't follow. But there's another strategy, and that is skeptical theism.
Yeah.
So what does the skeptical theist say in response to the problem of divine hiddenness? They don't have to use that kind of case like you just did.
That's right.
They can if they want, but they don't have to do that.
Yeah. Remember what we were taught when we talked about skeptical theism before, and just to bore your listeners, remember the skeptical theist, the central thought behind skeptical theism is that a certain argument depends, an argument against God's existence, for example, depends on a no-seeum inference, right? Where a no-seeum inference is an inference from the fact that we don't see something that we're looking for to the conclusion that probably that thing's not there, right? I don't see a full-size horse in this room, so probably there's no full-size horse in this room. That's a perfectly good no-seeum inference, right? Same with, it's a perfectly good no-seeum inference. Say, I don't see any milk in the fridge, so probably there's no milk in the fridge. But there are bad no-seeum inferences, right? And a bad no-seeum inference is one where we think that we don't have what it takes, such that if the thing were present, we'd probably see it, right? So if I don't see why the chess master has sacrificed her queen and I'm a total novice, it's not a good inference that there's no good reason for the chess master to sacrifice his queen. The fact that I can't see it in that case is neither here nor there, right? Or similarly, the fact that I can't see germs in this room is no good reason for me to conclude there aren't germs, because I don't have what it takes, such that if there were, I'd see them, right? So that's to distinguish the good no-seeum from the bad no-seeum inference. And then the skeptical theist essentially complains that the argument for atheism is in some way depending on a bad no-seeum inference. And in the case of Rowe's evidential argument, the no-seeum inference seemed to be something like this. We don't see what good reasons God could have for allowing the horrors like the Bambi case or the Sue case. So probably there is no good reason. And then we have our reasons for thinking that's a bad no-seeum inference. Now there's a parallel no-seeum inference, I think, in this case. And it's built into the way that Schellenberg thinks about too. And it goes something like this, that no-seeum inference has to be something like this. We can't see any good reason God could have for allowing reasonable non-belief. So probably there is no good reason for God to allow reasonable non-belief. And then from that gets built into the conclusion, or that gets built into the premise of why you would think a perfectly loving being wouldn't allow reasonable non-belief. God couldn't have a good reason for that. And yet, if you're already sympathetic to the skeptical theist response to Rowe-style evidential arguments, it looks like you can be equally sympathetic to skeptical responses to that little inference that looks to be what's driving the second premise of Schellenberg's argument.
Okay. Yeah, that was clear. So in the book, then, you say, well, the proponent of the hiddenness argument can appeal to something that William Rowe said. William Rowe has this parent analogy. And can you explain how that can kind of serve as a response here to the skeptical theist?
Yeah, this is nice because I do think it's putting the skeptical theism to its full test. So you might remember, like, even when I was just doing it just now, I used the chess master case. Another common case for motivating skeptical theism is parental cases, right? I had to, oversee my son getting a pretty bad, painful injection once, and of course the idea that I couldn't explain to him why he had to get an injection. I think he was 6 or 7 at the time. To explain how an injection worked and what it was doing and why he was having some pneumonia, and so it was fairly serious. Like, to explain how pneumonia worked and what an antibiotic was going to do and why it had to be immediate, why it had to be put in with it, like all of that stuff was beyond the pale for him. He couldn't conceive of any of that, and so the skeptical theist sometimes latches onto images like that. See, they're part of the reason why we're in the situation we are with respect to the no-seem divine inference is because it's roughly like the relationship between a parent and a child. Like Justin, my son, couldn't see what good reasons I had for jabbing him with a long needle. So probably there was no good reason. No, that doesn't follow at all in that case, right? He would have been bad to reason that way. It would have been bad reasoning for him, tempting as it may have been. So skeptical theists have appealed to that parent analogy. Here's Rowe's twist on that. Rowe points out this, though. Okay, you skeptical theists who are deploying that parent analogy, note something. When your kid has to undergo some serious trauma that they can't understand, what do? Do you just sit back and let it happen? And no, you hug the child. You whisper to the child. You do your. I know I can't explain this to you, but I promise you, it's good. That's what a parent does. And then Rowe turns the knife, rightly, right, and says, "But look, there are lots of people who endure horrors, and they don't get anything like the whisper. They don't get anything like the hug. They don't get anything like the comforting words in the midst of their suffering of God saying, I can't explain to you why you have to undergo this, but I'm here and I love you." And the claim is, so that parent analogy that the skeptical theist was using gets turned back on the theist in what's intuitively a very powerful way.
How does the skeptical theist respond to that kind of reply?
Good. I mean, you can see it coming, and maybe everyone's going to tire of the skeptical theist response. But so call the kind of suffering now that Rowe has put his finger on, call it uncomforted, inscrutable evil. Right? It's evil that a suffering that a person has that they can't understand, and they don't get any comfort from it. Right? But now, look, the no-seem inference is still just as live, right? The no-seem inference now is, I can't see any good reason why God would allow uncomforted, inscrutable evil. So probably there is no good reason why God would allow uncomforted, inscrutable evil. And all I want to note, unhappily or not, is that if you are already sympathetic to the skeptical response to gratuitous evils, then you'll be sympathetic to them here, right? I mean, do I have what it takes such that if God did have a good reason for allowing uncomforted, inscrutable evils, I'd probably know what it was? I just shrug my shoulders to that. I don't think I have. I don't think I would know. I don't think maybe I would know, maybe I wouldn't, but I don't have any reason to be confident that I would know. And so I shouldn't accept that no-seem inference, even in that case, as powerful as it is.
Now, this pushes, to me, skeptical theism to a pretty...
That's right.
A pretty challenging point. It seems difficult to hold on to your skeptical theism because it brings you to this objection. It seems like skeptical theism works no matter what kind of evil there is, no matter the amount of it or the distribution of it. Yeah. It seems like no form of evil, period, could threaten theistic belief if we accept skeptical theism. Yeah. So do you think this is and that seems like a problem. If your theory can just, allow anything and everything, then isn't that a problem for the theory? So how can the skeptical theist respond to that sort of objection?
Good. I don't know. I mean, I do think this is where partly why I was sort of noting earlier, Jordan, about the resistance, my hesitance is to go all the way with skeptical theism, so to speak, or at least to take skeptical theism neat, right? That is to just think of so many of our responses to the problem of evil and to hiddenness sort of gravitate to a monism. Like we're always looking for the one silver bullet. Like what's the thing that answers the problem? I'll just note now for posterity, right? The reasons for evil, the reasons for hiddenness strike me upon reflection as being totally multifarious. Like there's no reason to think that there's one account that gets them all. Okay, so I just want to note. So what I'm going to say about skeptical theism is not just a sort of dodge on skeptical theism. It's motivated independently by the idea that we should have never have thought that that God's reasons, if God has good reasons for allowing the evils, that there's just one, right? I mean, there are different kinds of evils and different kinds of sufferings and different kinds of contexts, and who knows how. So just that's one thing to say. But now, to the point, let's just make it as sharp as we can. So it does look like if you go in for the straightforward skeptical theistic response, the big way of framing the problem is the world's sufferings evidence that there's no God, right? And the skeptical theist looks like she's trying to say it doesn't even count as any evidence at all because you need to have good grounds for accepting the no-seum inference. Now, I'm with you, Jordan. Now consider what I sometimes have called excruciating world. Here's the world. The world is one in which human beings, or beings roughly enough like us, come into existence and we're in excruciating pain for 20 minutes. That's the whole life. We just live for 20 minutes in excruciating pain on the order of like a breech birth or something, unanesthetized breech birth. That's it. And then you pass out of existence and that's it. And now you ask me, if the world was like that, every sentient creature just existed for 20 minutes in excruciating pain, that world, that distribution of pain and pleasure in that world strikes me as pretty good evidence there's no God. That's what I would want to say about that world. So notice, but the skeptical theist, as you're rightly noting, Jordan, the skeptical theist will say, can propose her counter reply to that argument just as well, right? Well, if God had good reasons for allowing excruciating world, would I know what they were? Again, I guess I have to shrug my shoulders to that. And so doesn't it look like the skeptical response works just as well as excruciating world? And I don't want to accept that the pain and pleasure distributions at excruciating world wouldn't be some evidence, indeed good evidence, that there was no God. I want to accept that. Yeah, I think that's a serious issue. The first thing I want to say is, as I was already noting, I don't think skeptical theism is best taken neat, right? So, like I would want to note, our world isn't excruciating world, right? And there are real live debates. It's part of the debate about freedom of the will, of how much goods there are in it and how they're related to the evils. That's contentious, but no one denies that there are great goods in this world. And no one denies this, I think, that at least in a wide range of cases, theists have been able to show, with respect to a lot of evils, that God could have a good reason for allowing those evils. So there's some successes at what you might call broad theotic or defensive maneuvers, such that now when skeptical theism is raised, it's not raised sort of just simpliciter in the dark as in response to the evils in the world. It's raised with a recognition that we've identified lots of goods, and we've identified lots of ways in which even a morally perfect being and an all-powerful being could have reasons for allowing the evils that we find. Are there some we don't see that? Yes, there are some we don't see that. But do we have better reasons for making inferences about those things because of the way the world actually is? I say maybe so, and so the no-seum inference in the standard problem might be problematic in ways that, if it was excruciating world, it would be a different story. So that's one thing to say. And then the other thing, which I'm not sure about this one, Jordan, so I'm going to get it out, and your viewers can send me emails and hate mail and what have you. But there's a kind of a tu quoque response. There's a kind of, and what about you response that goes like this. I have conceded that there's something intellectually, and maybe worse, perverse about deploying skeptical theism at excruciating world, right? That seems that something's untoward about that. And then the question is, does that infect all uses of skeptical theism, even in non-excruciating world, even in the actual world? Okay, and you might be tempted to think, yeah, if it works in any world, and that's bad, then it shouldn't work here. And I just want to know, but look, hold on. Compare now Itchworld. Itchworld is like this. It's a hedonistic paradise. Every sentient creature has absolutely wonderful lives of the fullest kinds of pleasures and enjoyments and satisfactions. But there are just a couple creatures in this world that get a little rashy itch every once in a while. Like something like from the thing that you get from a mosquito bite. A few people get that. At Itchworld, is the itch strong evidence that there's no God? And I think we should all say, no. I mean, it's a suffering, no doubt, but it's not strong evidence that there is no God. But here's what I don't say. I don't say, well, look, if your argument against the existence of God on the basis of evil is perverse when applied to Itchworld, then it's perverse when applied to the actual world. I don't say that because that doesn't seem right, even though you might think it's on the same continuum. So what I want to press is that there's some respect in which both the problem of evil itself and the skeptical theistic response sort of take place away from the margins, right? And that the appropriateness both of raising the problem and of the skeptical theistic response has to do with the fact that we're positioned in a world that's sort of ambiguous about goods. It has a certain kind of ambiguity about the goods and evils. And so I hope that in some respect that undoes the force of that worry about the use of skeptical theism in the worst cases.
Excellent. All right. Well, we walked through the argument, looked at some ways of rejecting 3, ways of rejecting 2, ways of withholding judgment or casting doubt on 2, and then ways of, I guess, using skeptical theism as a way of, I guess, casting doubt on 2. So, and then responses from the proponent of this argument to the skeptical theist and the skeptical theist response to that and so forth. I really appreciate you taking this much time to do this.
Sure.
Before we go, where does this leave us? Where are we at now?
I don't know. I mean, here's what I guess I hope is that we're at a place of seeing a basic defensive posture in response to both the evidential and the hiddenness problems that are structurally quite similar in feeling its force. But I want to be quick to say this, Jordan, right? I don't think this defensive posture that I've been developing over these few sessions silences the problem of evil. I don't think it does away with it. I don't think it shows that everybody who's persuaded by the arguments is being irrational. Notice, I don't think that everything I'm showing indicates that every theist is rational, right? I mean, there can be irrational theism in the face of these arguments. There are probably people who ought to respond to these arguments by doing a lot more thinking about them than they're doing, and their their confidence may be in some respects irrational. So I'm not saving every theist from irrationality. It's just this, that I think we've got the structure in place such that the thoughtful theist can be rational in maintaining her belief in the existence of God, even in the face of these arguments.
All right, well said. Thank you so much for joining me, and look forward to the next episode where we're going to look at theodicies. So go check out our video on the logical problem, the evidential problem. You just watched the divine hiddenness. There's one more left. It's a 4-part series. It's on theodicies. We'll see you then.